Keeping score is something that we do not only on the golf course, on the playing field of whatever it might be, sport that we participate in. Keeping score is something we do well, especially when it comes to offenses, especially when it comes to somebody hurting us or we hurting them. Although usually on that end, on the giving end of hurting others, maybe we're not quite so good at keeping score as we are when people injure us, offend us, hurt us, sin against us. Keeping score is something that is normal and common for you and I. It's innate in our humanness. And so thank God that somebody finally has the courage, like Peter, to ask the question we're all thinking, maybe not consciously all the time, but certainly the question is always lingering in the back of our minds. So thank God for Peter today. He gets right to the point. How many times do I need to forgive? It makes sense, doesn't it? Especially given the fact that you and I are oftentimes keeping score. It's important then to know how many times we have to forgive another. Now, Peter, in his desire to seek the answer, is choosing to be generous when he asks the question 7 times. And notice what Jesus does. He gives him an outlandish number, 77 times, because you and I all know that even though we keep score well, it's hard to remember once we get past 50. So Jesus was wise in inviting Peter to go and to raise that number a bit, but Jesus does something even more remarkable for Peter and for you and I today. He shifts the focus from how many times to simply how. Jesus gives you and I the beautiful gift today of helping us to recognize how it is that we are to forgive. Because once we develop a skill around how it is that we are to forgive, then the number of times doesn't make any difference. Because we've learned the valuable lesson that comes from letting go, from forgiving the entire debt. So how does Jesus move Peter and you and I from focusing in on the score, on the number, to how it is that we are to forgive? Quite simply through that beautiful parable of the kingdom of heaven, may be likened to a king and his servants. And as they come to settle the debts with the king, why, we are told of one individual who has a huge debt. And notice what happens. After the king demands his money be paid, why, the servant simply says, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full." And this is the line, this is the key that you and I need to be attentive to in today's gospel, because we are told by Matthew, the writer, that the king is moved with compassion. Moved with compassion. So that's the secret. That's the key that opens the door, that you and I might then have the ability to forgive and also hopefully to be forgiven. Compassion. What it means, my friends, is quite simply that you and I are willing for, if but a brief moment, to get out of our heads and to move to our hearts. And once we go there, why, then we realize that it would be wise for us to stand in that person's shoes. Now notice what I said. Stand in them. Don't walk in them. For heaven's sakes, you'll trip and kill yourself. We can't walk in another person's shoes. It's impossible. You can't walk in mine, and I can't walk in yours. But what I can do and what you can do is that we have the ability to stand in another's shoes, to begin to understand, to appreciate what it is that may or may not be going on in their life at the present time. And once we realize the suffering that might be going on in that person's life, why then compassion always calls you and I to something more. It's not just standing in the shoes, but then we get out of them and we strive. Compassion always calls you and I to strive to alleviate the suffering, to forgive the debt, to wipe the slate clean, to start over. That's what compassion enables you and I to do. But in the keeping of the score and the wanting to indeed find ways to retaliate, to seek revenge, to find reprisal in some sort of way, why you and I so oftentimes can forget the power and the gift that compassion can afford you and I, because it enables you and I then to forgive, and the healing ointment of forgiveness enables then for each of us to have a fresh start. Now, notice, by standing in another person's shoes, by being moved with compassion, it doesn't mean that we are striving again to walk in their shoes, or even by forgiving, it doesn't mean that we're trying to reinstate the way things were, because it'll never happen. Once the offense, once the sin, once that takes place in a relationship, it changes the relationship. You can't go back as much as you and I would love to. We can't go back to take back what we said, or to take back what we did, or to find that relationship so that it can go back to exactly the way it was. Notice the king doesn't even want repayment from his debt. He just forgives it. He doesn't want anything back, but rather he wants the servants. And Jesus wants you and I to move forward, and that's the power that comes from forgiveness, why it gives us the freedom then to move forward. And how do we do that? Well, Sirach tells us today to remember your last days. Remember death and decay. Kind of morbid, isn't it? Why would Sirach tell us to do that? Because I think so oftentimes in our desire not to forgive, and our desire not to seek reconciliation, is because somehow we hoped to punish that person. In reality, we're punishing ourselves. And somehow in the back of our minds, as crazy as it seems, we think we got all the time in the world. And I could stand here today and tell you hundreds of stories, because I'm in the funeral business, as you know. And I could tell you hundreds of stories of people that have come to me with regret. Regret because they didn't take the opportunity to say, I'm sorry. Regret because they clung to that sin, that offense that somebody leveled against them, and they refused to seek reconciliation and forgiveness, and all of a sudden now this person is no longer alive. The opportunity is no longer there. And then they are forced to live with that debt on their shoulders, day after day after day. So, my friends, we come to this table today, and we come and we receive the King's forgiveness. We receive the gift of having the slate wiped clean, and you and I are given another opportunity to start all over and to follow in the footsteps of Christ. So let us then choose to be moved with compassion today and every day, so that as we do so, we might seek forgiveness, we might extend forgiveness, we might come to know the power and the freedom of forgiveness.